They didn't just tear down my wall. They charged me 45 grand for the privilege. Brenda from the HOA said my reinforced concrete was an eyesore that ruined their million-dollar views. I told them the ocean doesn't care about aesthetics. 6 months later, the ocean proved me right. The Pacific Ocean doesn't smell like a vacation. Not here. It smells like iodine, rotting kelp, and crushed shells. It smells like things dying in the dark. If you stand on the shoreline of Pelican Bluffs long enough, you realize the water isn't a backdrop. It's an engine, a grinding, restless machine that eats rock and spits out sand. I knew this because I spent 40 years designing marine infrastructure, breakwaters, retaining walls, caissons. I know what water does to things built by men who prioritize glass over rebar. When I bought the lot at the bottom of the bluff, the real estate agent thought I was an idiot. It was a topographical depression, a natural catch basin right at sea level, flanked by steep, sandy cliffs. The rest of the Pelican Bluffs development was perched up high, a glittering crown of 3-story McMansions wrapped in cedar siding and floor-to-ceiling windows. They had the panoramic views. They had the prestige. I had the dirt, but I also had bedrock 30 feet down, and I had the permits from the county before the Homeowners Association tightened its manicured grip on the zoning laws. I built my house like a bunker. Cinder block core, steel framing, hurricane-grade glass. And then I built the wall. It wasn't pretty. I didn't design it to be. It was 12 feet of reinforced, high-strength Portland cement, battered back at a 5-degree angle to deflect wave energy. The footings went deep, anchored directly into the basalt below the sand. I spent $80,000 on the epoxy-coated rebar alone, tying the steel myself until my knuckles bled and my thumbs went numb. I left the concrete raw. No faux stone veneer, no pastel paint to blend in with the beige and eggshell color palette of the neighborhood. It was slate gray. It cured to the color of a bruised sky. It was a scar on the pristine coastline. I loved it. I'd sit on my porch with a mug of black coffee, watching the winter storms roll in. The wind would howl, throwing sheets of freezing rain sideways, and the ocean would throw itself against my gray slab. The wall would just stand there, absorbing the kinetic energy, sending plumes of white spray 30 feet into the air. I felt safe. I felt like I had drawn a line in the sand and told the Pacific, not here. The letters started arriving in April. The first one was printed on heavy stock cream paper. It felt expensive, the kind of paper that absorbs ink perfectly. It was tucked into my mailbox, smelling faintly of vanilla perfume. Dear neighbor, it read, it has come to the attention of the Pelican Bluffs Architectural Review Committee that an unapproved perimeter structure has been erected on your property. I tossed it in the trash with the grocery store circulars. I was grandfathered in. The county had stamped my blueprints. The HOA's bylaws applied to paint colors and mailbox dimensions, not structural engineering. Or so I thought. 2 weeks later, another letter. This one was certified. A fine of $100 a day for an unauthorized architectural modification. I walked up the hill. The asphalt was black and perfectly smooth. Not a single crack. The lawns were impossibly green, fed by subterranean sprinklers that hissed like angry snakes. I knocked on the door of 402 Ocean View Drive, Brenda Carmichael's house. Brenda was the HOA president. She had the kind of aggressive blonde bob that looked sharp enough to cut glass, and she wore athleisure wear that had never seen the inside of a gym. Arthur, she said, opening the door. She didn't smile. She just looked at my boots, checking for mud. Brenda, what is this? I held up the certified letter. She sighed, a practiced, exasperated sound. It's a notice, Arthur. We've received dozens of complaints. Your barricade. It's an eyesore. It completely disrupts the visual harmony of the coastline. It's a seawall, Brenda. It's keeping the ocean out of my living room. We all live on the ocean, Arthur, she said smoothly. None of us felt the need to build a prison wall. Look at the Hendersons. She gestured toward a house down the street. It had a delicate, white-painted wooden bulkhead that looked like it would snap if you leaned on it too hard. It's about maintaining the property values. Your wall is blocking the sunset line for the lower cul-de-sac. The sunset line? I laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound. We live in the Cascadia subduction zone, Brenda. If that fault slips, your property values are going to be floating halfway to Hawaii. My wall stays. I turned and walked away. I could feel her watching my back. My shirt was sticking to my shoulders with cold sweat. I wasn't a brave man, standing up to tyranny. I was just tired. And the thought of dealing with these people made my stomach churn with acid. I thought the facts would protect me. That was my first mistake. Facts don't matter when people are obsessed with a view. By October, the fines had ballooned to $12,000. They didn't just send letters anymore, they sent Greg. Greg was a lawyer who lived in the largest house on the bluff, a sprawling monstrosity of glass and steel cantilevered over a cliff face. He wore cashmere sweaters and had hands softer than expensive butter. They hauled me into an emergency HOA board meeting at the community center. The room smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor wax. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a high-pitched whine that set my teeth on edge. I sat at a folding table across from Brenda, Greg, and 3 other board members. They had binders, thick, color-coded binders. I had a manila folder filled with geological surveys, tidal charts, and historical seismic data. Mr. Pendleton, Greg started, steepling his soft fingers. Let's not make this adversarial. We just want to bring your property into compliance. The CC and Rs are very clear. Section 4, paragraph B. No structure shall obscure the natural sightlines of neighboring properties. My property sits 40 feet below yours, Greg, I said, my voice rasping. My throat felt dry. I'm not obscuring your sightlines. You can see right over my roof. It's the aesthetic sightline, Arthur, Brenda interjected, tapping a manicured nail on her binder. When we look down, we want to see the natural slope of the beach. Instead, we see a brutalist concrete slab. It looks like a Soviet bunker. The Thompsons are trying to sell their home, and their buyers specifically cited your wall as a negative. I opened my folder. The paper felt flimsy in my rough hands. Look at this. I slid a topographic map across the table. This entire development is built on loose sand and glacial till. If we get a king tide combined with a southwesterly storm, the wave run-up will breach the lower dunes. If we get a seismic event, the liquefaction alone. Arthur, Greg interrupted, his tone dripping with condescending patience. We aren't here to discuss apocalyptic hypotheticals. We are here to discuss a clear violation of the bylaws. It's not hypothetical. I slapped my hand on the table. The coffee cups rattled. Several board members flinched. I hated myself for losing control. I knew how I looked, an unhinged, disheveled old man yelling about the end of the world, but the fear was real. It lived in my chest. The water is rising. The storms are getting worse. That wall isn't a landscape feature, it's a life preserver. We have a seawall, Brenda said stiffly. The developer installed a retaining barrier when the subdivision was built. That barrier is decorative. It's stacked riprap and vinyl sheet piling. It's buried in sand. A decent winter swell will scour it out in 3 hours. That is your opinion, Greg said, sliding my map back to me without looking at it. The reality is you did not seek ARC approval. You ignored the stop work orders. You have ignored the fines. He pulled a thick document from his binder. We have petitioned the county court for an injunction. Unless you remove the structure within 30 days, the HOA will hire a contractor to remove it for you, and a lien will be placed on your property to cover the costs. I stared at the paper. The black text blurred. My chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a steel band around my ribs and was slowly turning a wrench. You can't do that, I whispered. We already have the judge's signature, Arthur, Greg said softly. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. I fought them. I drained my savings account hiring my own lawyer, a young guy who worked out of a strip mall 2 towns over. But HOA covenants are ironclad in this state. You sign away your rights when you buy the deed. The judge didn't care about tensile strength or wave dynamics. He cared about the contract. I lost. The night before the deadline, I walked out to the wall. It was November now. The air was frigid, tasting of salt and impending rain. The ocean was black and loud, a low, constant roar that vibrated through the soles of my boots. I ran my hand over the rough concrete. It was cold, unyielding. I had built it to last 100 years. I pressed my forehead against the damp stone. I didn't cry. I was too empty for that. I just stood there in the dark, listening to the water, feeling a profound, nauseating sense of exposure. They were going to peel my armor off and leave me naked on the shoreline. The heavy machinery arrived at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. The vibration hit me before the noise did. A deep, rhythmic shudder through the floorboards of my kitchen. I set my coffee mug down on the counter. It was rattling. I walked out to the front porch. The sky was the color of dirty dishwater, spitting a fine, freezing drizzle. A massive yellow excavator, its tracks chewing up the dormant grass of my front yard, was positioning itself near the north end of the wall. Beside it idled a skid steer and a dump truck. A crew of men in high-vis vests and hard hats stood around, drinking from thermoses, pointing at my wall. Up on the ridge, silhouetted against the gray sky, stood Brenda. She had an umbrella and a travel mug. A few other neighbors had gathered too. They were treating it like a ribbon-cutting ceremony. They were watching the removal of the eyesore. I walked down the steps. The foreman, a burly guy with a thick red beard and a clipboard, caught sight of me. He looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Pendleton?" he asked, stepping forward. "That's me." "Sorry, buddy. Just doing the job we were contracted for. You got the notice, right?" "I got it." I shoved my hands deep into my jacket pockets to hide the trembling. "You're going to need a bigger breaker attachment," I told him, nodding at the excavator. The foreman chuckled a little dismissively. "We bring down overpasses with that rig, sir. We'll have this cleared by noon." "Okay," I said. I stepped back, leaned against my porch railing and waited. The excavator roared, belching a cloud of black diesel exhaust that immediately hung heavy in the damp air. The smell was sharp, metallic, and foul. The operator swung the massive hydraulic arm around, positioning the steel spike of the hydraulic breaker against the top edge of my wall. He triggered the hammer. Tat, 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 tat. The noise was physically painful. It was a percussive, bone-rattling assault that made my teeth ache. Dust bloomed, a thick gray cloud of pulverized limestone and silica. The hammer dug in for 10 seconds, then stopped. The dust cleared. The wall was barely chipped. A shallow white divot marked the spot where the spike had hit. Nothing else. I saw the foreman frown. He signaled the operator. Again. Tat, 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 tat. Sparks flew as the steel bit into the concrete. The excavator cab actually shook with the recoil. The operator kept the hammer engaged for a full minute. The noise echoed off the bluff, a deafening mechanical scream. When he stopped, there was a hole about 3 inches deep, and gleaming inside the crater was a thick, green-coated steel rod, the rebar. I had tied it on 6-inch centers, a tight, unyielding cage of steel hidden beneath the gray skin. "Jesus," I heard the foreman mutter. He unclipped a radio from his belt. "Hey, Dave, we're gonna need the shears. And get the demo saws off the truck. This thing is packed." It took them 3 days. 3 days of relentless, deafening violence. The smell of diesel exhaust and burning metal permeated my house. The fine gray dust coated everything. My windows, my porch, my truck. It tasted like chalk and ash in the back of my throat. I didn't wipe it away. I watched them struggle. I watched the heavy machinery groan and smoke, fighting for every inch. Every time they hit a rebar cage, the grinder would scream, throwing showers of orange sparks into the rain. There was a bitter, sour satisfaction in it. My wall was dying, but it was making them bleed to kill it. By Friday evening, it was gone. Where the 12-foot barrier had stood, there was only a ragged trench of churned earth and jagged stumps of steel protruding from the subterranean footings. The dump trucks hauled away the last load of broken concrete, their tires sinking deep into the mud they had created. The silence that followed was heavy. Wrong. I stood on my porch. The wind hit me instantly. Before, the wall had broken the coastal gusts, creating a pocket of dead air around my house. Now, the wind slammed directly into my front door, whistling through the weather stripping. I looked out. The view was entirely unobstructed. I could see the wet sand, the churning gray surf, the vast empty horizon. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. I looked up at the ridge. Brenda's house sat there, its massive floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the dull twilight. They had their view back. A week later, the bill arrived. $45,620. For the heavy equipment, the extra labor, the specialized diamond-tipped saw blades they had ruined cutting through my rebar. Attached was a note from the HOA lawyers stating that if the bill was not paid within 60 days, they would initiate foreclosure proceedings. I sat at my kitchen table, the paper heavy in my hands. The wind howled outside, rattling the hurricane glass. I didn't have $45,000. The lawyers had taken the rest. I was 68 years old, my hands were shot, and my pension barely covered my property taxes. I walked out to my shed. I found my tape measure and a notebook. I drove into town, to the lumber yard. I spent the last $300 in my checking account on half-inch marine-grade plywood and a box of Tapcon masonry screws. When I got home, I started cutting the wood. I measured the lower windows of my house, the ones facing the ocean. I cut the plywood to fit exactly over the frames. I didn't install them. I just stacked them in the hallway, leaning against the drywall, ready. I knew it wouldn't be enough. Plywood against the Pacific Ocean is like holding up a piece of cardboard in a gunfight. But it was all I had left. I had been stripped of my armor, left exposed to the raw, grinding mechanics of the earth, just so a woman on a hill could watch the sun touch the water. I went to bed that night listening to the surf. It sounded closer. Because it was. It happened on a Tuesday in late January. 2 months after they tore my wall down. The weather had been building for days. A low-pressure system parked itself offshore, driving relentless, freezing rain sideways into the bluff. The sky was a bruised, heavy purple, and the ocean was agitated, frothing at the mouth. Without my wall to deflect the energy, the surf hammered the natural slope of my yard, taking away an inch of sand and topsoil with every high tide. I watched my property line dissolve from my kitchen window. I drank cheap whiskey and waited for the foreclosure notice to show up in the mail. When the earth finally gave way, it didn't start with a shake. It started with a sound. It was a low-frequency hum, so deep it bypassed my ears and vibrated directly in my sternum. It sounded like a freight train idling beneath the foundation of my house. Dun. I put my glass down on the counter. The amber liquid was shivering. Then the primary wave hit. The floor dropped an inch. I lost my footing and hit the linoleum hard, my knee taking the brunt of the impact. The air pressure in the room spiked, popping my ears. Before I could even push myself up, the secondary waves arrived, and the world simply tore itself apart. This wasn't a California roller coaster earthquake. This was a Cascadia megathrust rupture. Two tectonic plates that had been locked together for 300 years, suddenly violently divorcing. The house didn't just shake, it bucked. It was a chaotic, lateral violence. The sound was deafening, a chorus of snapping timber, tearing drywall, and the high-pitched shriek of nails being pulled through wood. My refrigerator tipped forward and slammed into the island, bursting open and vomiting glass jars and condiments across the floor. The hurricane glass in my front windows bowed inward, vibrating violently, but miraculously held. I was pressed flat against the floor, my fingers splayed against the cold linoleum, trying to find purchase on a planet that had suddenly turned to liquid. My stomach pitched. I dry heaved, the smell of spilled pickles and old dust filling my nose. Above the roar of my own house, I could hear a deeper, more terrifying sound coming from outside. The bedrock itself was groaning. It lasted for 4 minutes, 4 minutes of relentless, grinding terror. When the shaking finally stopped, the silence that followed was suffocating. I lay there for a long time, my chest heaving, listening to the dust settle. The electricity was out. The hum of the refrigerator was gone. Slowly, my joints aching, I pushed myself up. My hands were covered in a fine layer of pulverized drywall. I tasted blood in the back of my throat. I had bitten my tongue without realizing it. I limped into the living room. Everything I owned was on the floor, but the cinderblock core of the house was intact. My steel framing had done its job. I stumbled to the front window and looked out at the ocean. Something was wrong. The Pacific Ocean, the restless, churning engine that had battered my property for days, had stopped. I unlocked the front door. The frame had warped slightly, and I had to throw my shoulder against the heavy wood to force it open. I stepped out onto the porch. The freezing rain had tapered off to a heavy mist. The air smelled wrong. The usual sharp tang of ozone and salt spray was gone, replaced by an overwhelming putrid stench. It smelled like sulfur, rotting kelp, and centuries of undisturbed mud. It smelled like the bottom of the sea. I walked down my steps, my boots crunching on shattered roof tiles. I looked toward the shoreline. The water was gone, not receding like a low tide. It was draining away, sucked back into the horizon with a wet, hissing sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. The seabed was exposed for hundreds of yards. It was an alien landscape of slick, black rocks, thrashing kelp forests laid flat, and frantic, silver flashes of stranded fish suffocating in the open air. The water was still moving outward, a massive, unnatural withdrawal that exposed the jagged, dark contours of the continental shelf. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My throat closed up. I had studied marine infrastructure. I knew exactly what I was looking at. The ocean wasn't retreating. It was reloading. I looked up at the bluff. People were pouring out of their houses. I saw Brenda standing on her cantilevered deck, clutching a silk robe tightly around herself. Greg was out there too, a few houses down, pointing a cell phone at the exposed seabed. They were disoriented. They had survived the quake, their expensive houses still standing, and now they were watching the spectacle. Some of them were actually walking down the asphalt path toward the beach. "Get back!" I screamed. My voice sounded thin and reedy in the damp air. "Get to higher ground." The wind snatched the words out of my mouth and threw them over my shoulder. They couldn't hear me, or if they did, they just saw crazy old Arthur Pendleton yelling on his ruined lawn. Panic, sharp and cold, flooded my veins. I couldn't save them. I couldn't even save myself. I had maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20. I sprinted back into the house, slipping on the spilled mayonnaise in the kitchen, and scrambled out the back door to the hallway where I had stacked the plywood. I grabbed the first sheet. It was heavy, stiff with cold. I dragged it into the living room, hoisted it up, and slammed it against the frame of the largest ocean-facing window. I clamped it with one elbow, fumbling in my pocket for the box of masonry, screws, and my heavy-duty cordless drill. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped half the screws. They clattered against the floorboards, rolling into the dust and debris. I cursed, spitting blood and saliva, and grabbed a screw. I jammed it into the magnetic bit of the drill, pressed it against the pre-drilled hole in the plywood, and pulled the trigger. The drill whined, the masonry bit biting into the concrete framing around the window. It caught, driving the screw home with a loud ratcheting sound. 1. I moved to the next corner. My breath was coming in ragged gasps. The air was so cold my lungs burned, but sweat was pouring down my forehead, stinging my eyes. 2, 3, 4. I hoisted the next sheet. And the next. By the fourth window, my drill started to slow. The high-pitched whine dropped to a sluggish, grinding hum. The battery was dying. "No, no, no," I muttered, pressing my weight against the back of the drill to force the screw in. The bit slipped, stripping the head of the screw with a harsh metallic screech. My hand jerked, and the drill bit sliced across my knuckles. I didn't feel the pain. I just felt the wet warmth of the blood. I switched batteries, slamming a fresh one into the base, and kept drilling. Through the last uncovered window, I looked out at the horizon. The gray sky met the gray horizon in a flat, indistinct line. But something was breaking that line. A dark, jagged ridge was forming miles offshore. It didn't look like a wave. It looked like a geographical feature, a new mountain range rising out of the water, and it was moving toward us. It wasn't a curling breaker. Tsunami waves don't look like surfing waves. They look like the ocean itself has been elevated by 50 feet. It was a surging, chaotic plateau of water, moving at the speed of a commercial airliner. The sound arrived before the wave did. It was a sustained, roaring hiss, like a jet engine running in a wind tunnel. It grew louder by the second, vibrating the plywood beneath my hands. I drove the last screw into the final board. The living room plunged into a suffocating, dusty twilight. The only light came from the gaps between the wood and the frame. I dropped the drill. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. I looked around my reinforced cinder block box, the hurricane glass, the tap cons, the plywood. It was pathetic. I had built a wall of 12-inch reinforced concrete to stop this ocean, and they had taken it away for a view. Now I was standing behind half-inch plywood, hoping it would hold back 1,000,000 tons of moving water. I turned and ran for the center of the house. I locked myself in the interior guest bathroom. It was the absolute dead center of the structure, walled in on all four sides by the cinder block core. There were no windows. I sat on the cold tile floor, my back pressed against the bathtub, and pulled my knees to my chest. In the pitch black, my senses dialed up to an agonizing degree. I could smell the dust in the air. I could feel the blood drying on my knuckles. I could hear my own pulse thumping erratically in my ears. And then the ocean arrived. The impact wasn't a splash. It was a detonation. The ground slammed upward, lifting me off the tiles for a fraction of a second. A concussive shock wave ripped through the house. I heard the front door explode inward, the wood splintering like a matchstick. Then came the sound of the hurricane glass failing. It didn't shatter. It blew out entirely, groaning under the immense static pressure before failing with a deep, resonant boom. Water blasted into the living room. I could hear it violently destroying everything I owned. The heavy oak dining table, the leather sofa, the bookshelves, they were pulverized, slammed against the interior walls by a surge of black, freezing water. The noise was absolute. It was the sound of complete mechanical destruction. It was rocks, trees, sand, and debris suspended in a liquid blender, grinding my home down to its bones. Water shoved its way under the bathroom door. It was ice cold. It hit my boots, soaking my socks instantly. Within seconds, the water level in the small room rose to my knees, then to my waist. I scrambled up, standing inside the dry bathtub, pressing my hands against the ceiling. The house vibrated, groaning under the sheer force. The steel beams above me squealed, a high-pitched metallic torsion that made me want to cover my ears. Hold, I prayed to the concrete, to the deep footings, to the epoxy-coated rebar I had tied with my own bleeding hands. Just hold. Outside the walls, a different kind of destruction was happening. I could hear it above the roar of the water, a deep, tearing rumble, the sound of a landslide. The millions of gallons of water weren't just hitting my house. They were slamming into the base of the bluff composed entirely of loose sand, glacial till, and developer arrogance. I pictured the HOA's decorative retaining wall, the stacked riprap and vinyl sheet piling. The water wouldn't even notice it. The surge would scour the sand out from beneath the rocks in seconds, liquefying the foundation of the hill. I heard a sound, like a massive tree snapping, followed by a series of dull, heavy thuds that vibrated through the water filling my house. It was the sound of structural failure on a massive scale. The water in the bathroom reached my chest. The cold was paralyzing. My lungs seized, and I had to force myself to take shallow, rapid breaths. It smelled of diesel fuel, raw sewage, and churned earth. I waited in the dark to drown. But the water stopped rising. For 10 agonizing minutes, the house shuddered and wept. The water swirled around me, thick with silt and unseen debris, bumping against my legs. Then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, the pressure shifted. The roar changed pitch. Was it the ocean, having thrown its weight onto the land, was now dragging it all back? The suction was immense. I could hear the water violently pulling the guts of my house out through the shattered windows. The water level in the bathroom began to drop. It went from my chest to my waist to my knees. The retreat was almost as violent as the arrival, pulling mud, rocks, and wreckage back into the abyss. Then there was only the sound of rushing water, like a flash flood tapering off in a canyon. I stayed in the bathtub for hours. I was shivering so violently, I thought my teeth would crack. The cold had seeped into my marrow. I didn't move until I realized there was a pale, gray sliver of light illuminating the water underneath the doorframe. Morning, I stepped out of the tub. My legs were numb, heavy as lead. The water had drained, leaving behind 6 inches of slick, foul-smelling gray mud. I pushed against the bathroom door. It was jammed. Debris had piled up against the outside. I slammed my shoulder into the wood once, twice, 3 times. The door cracked and I squeezed through the opening. My house was a gutted carcass. The interior drywall was completely gone, stripped away to the steel studs and the cinder block. The floor was a continuous layer of thick, gray sludge, littered with unrecognizable fragments of my life. A mangled piece of ductwork hung from the ceiling. My refrigerator was nowhere to be seen. I waded through the mud toward the front of the house. The plywood I had screwed in was gone. The window frames were completely empty, bent outward by the suction of the receding wave. I stepped out through the gaping hole where my front window used to be. The freezing morning air hit me, waking me up slightly. I stood on the concrete lip of my foundation and looked at the world. It was gone. The beach didn't exist anymore. The coastline had been fundamentally redrawn. Where there used to be a gentle slope of sand leading down to the surf, there was now a sheer drop-off, a jagged cliff face carved by the violent scouring of the receding water. I looked left and right. My house stood alone on a solitary pedestal of basalt and deep-driven concrete footings. The sand all around my property had been washed away, exposing the 20-foot concrete pylons I had driven into the bedrock decades ago. My house looked like an oil rig, standing above a plain of mud. My seawall had been destroyed by men, but the foundation I had built for my home had defied the ocean. I turned slowly, my boots sucking in the mud, and looked up at the bluff. My breath caught in my throat. The bluff wasn't a bluff anymore. It was a catastrophic collapse. The liquefaction I had warned them about, the very thing Greg had dismissed as an apocalyptic hypothetical, had played out with brutal mathematical certainty. The decorative HOA seawall was entirely gone. Not a single stone remained. Without the toe of the slope supported, the entire face of the hill had sheared off and slid into the ocean. It was a massive concave scar of raw, weeping earth, and the million-dollar homes were in it. The pristine black asphalt of Ocean View Drive ended abruptly in jagged, broken chunks hanging over the void. The subterranean sprinkler systems were exposed, hissing weak jets of water into the air. Greg's house, the sprawling monstrosity of glass and steel, had broken in half. The front portion, cantilevered over the cliff face, had simply snapped off under the sudden lack of support. It lay in a mangled heap of twisted I-beams and shattered luxury halfway down the mudslide. I kept turning. I looked for 402 Ocean View Drive, Brenda's house. It was gone, not damaged, not slid down the hill, erased. Her property had been positioned exactly at the apex of the curve, where the wave run-up had focused its maximum kinetic energy. The sandy foundation had simply washed out from under it. A massive chunk of her roof, covered in high-end slate tiles, was wedged into the mud 50 yards away from my property. A section of her pale cedar siding, still attached to a sheared 2x4, was tangled in a pile of uprooted pine trees. The neighborhood was a debris field. cashmere sweaters, shattered flat-screen televisions, chunks of drywall, and expensive deck furniture were strewn across the slick, gray mud like garbage in a landfill. I stood there for a long time. The wind picked up, biting through my wet clothes. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt a fiery, triumphant surge of righteousness. I told you so. I had stood in their sterile community center, holding the geological surveys, and they had laughed at me. They had fined me. They had ripped my armor away to preserve their aesthetic. But I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel anything except a crushing, bone-deep exhaustion. Nature doesn't care about "I told you so." The ocean doesn't issue apologies. It operates on gravity, pressure, and mass. It doesn't care if you have a permit, and it doesn't care if you have a view. I heard the distant, rhythmic thumping of a Coast Guard helicopter approaching from the north. The rescue operations were starting. They would find survivors. They would find bodies. The county would declare it a disaster zone. The insurance companies would tie it up in court for a decade. And the developers would eventually come back to build again. Because human amnesia is as deep as the sea. I climbed back into the ruined shell of my house. I walked into the kitchen area. The island was gone. The cabinets torn off the walls. But plastered against a remaining section of interior cinder block, glued there by the gray mud and the seawater, was a piece of paper. I reached out and carefully peeled it off the wall. The ink was heavily smeared, the heavy stock cream paper bloated and tearing at the edges. But I could still read the letterhead. Pelican Bluffs Homeowners Association. It was the final invoice, $45,620 for the removal of an eyesore, for the restoration of the view. I looked at the smeared ink. I looked through the gaping hole of my front wall, at the gray, churning ocean, and the millions of dollars of shattered wood and broken glass scattered across the mud. They got exactly what they paid for. The view was completely unobstructed. I crumpled the wet paper in my bloody hand, dropped it into the mud, and went to wait for the helicopters. If this story of arrogance versus the ocean resonated with you, hit that like button to help others discover it. Which part frustrated you the most? The HOA's ignorance or the brutal reality of the wave? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with anyone who's ever had to deal with an unreasonable HOA. Subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, grounded stories of survival and karma.